You don't need to live on a beach or under a hole in the ozone layer to be affected by UV radiation anymore. Thanks to climate change, what used to be a fairly predictable dance between sunlight and atmosphere has turned into a chaotic free-for-all. Around the world, people in places once considered low risk for UV damage are now experiencing more intense and prolonged ultraviolet exposure than ever before, often without realizing it. And unlike rising sea levels or heat waves, this invisible threat doesn't come with dramatic visuals. But its effects on skin, eyes, ecosystems, and public health are real, cumulative, and quietly getting worse. Let's start with the ozone layer, the Earth's natural sunscreen. Sitting high in the stratosphere, ozone absorbs much of the sun's UVB radiation before it can reach the ground. But human-made chemicals like chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, damaged that shield significantly in the 20th century, punching a now famous seasonal hole over Antarctica. Thanks to international agreements like the Montreal Protocol, ozone levels have been slowly recovering, but it's not a steady fix. Some regions, including parts of the Arctic and mid-latitude zones, still experience periodic thinning events. And even minor ozone depletion can allow more UVB to flood through, enough to increase the risk of skin damage, eye disease, and immune suppression in exposed populations. Now, add climate change to the mix. Rising global temperatures and shifting air patterns don't just warm the planet, they also disrupt the chemical and physical dynamics of the upper atmosphere, which can affect ozone recovery and UV filtering. For instance, warming at the Earth's surface is linked to cooling in the stratosphere, which may slow ozone repair and make it more vulnerable to future damage. It's a bit of a cruel twist. While we're sweating through hotter summers, the protective layer above us is chilling and possibly weakening. Then there's air pollution, which interacts with UV exposure in paradoxical ways. At first glance, one might assume that smog and haze would block UV radiation like a dirty window. And in heavily polluted cities, it can, but not always in the way you'd hope. Certain pollutants, especially aerosols and nitrogen oxides, can actually break down ozone locally, letting in more UV. And as climate change stokes more wildfires and dust storms, we're seeing a rise in particulate matter that alters how sunlight moves through the atmosphere. Some particles scatter light, some absorb it, and others catalyze chemical reactions that affect both ozone and UV penetration. In short, pollution doesn't just dim the sun, it sometimes cracks open the door to more UV. Climate change is also extending the UV season in many regions. Warmer springs and longer summers mean more days each year with high UV indices, even in places like Northern Europe or parts of Canada, where people historically didn't worry much about sun exposure. And the sun's angle, which determines how directly UV rays hit the Earth, doesn't change, but how much time we spend outside and how intense the background radiation certainly does. This shift is subtle but significant. Even a few extra weeks of elevated UV can increase lifetime risk of skin damage, especially for children and adolescents whose exposure habits are being shaped now. And here's where the real problem kicks in. People aren't adjusting their behavior fast enough. Many still assume UV risk is something you only worry about at the beach, near the equator, or during peak summer heat. But UV isn't heat. You can get burned skiing in the Alps, hiking in April, or walking under a cloud-dappled sky in Scandinavia. And thanks to climate-driven changes, the invisible danger is popping up in places and seasons we aren't culturally conditioned to expect. That's why we're seeing rising skin cancer rates in countries like the UK, Germany, and Sweden, places with temperate climates but rapidly shifting UV exposure patterns. It's not just about skin either. Increased UV affects cataract formation, immune system regulation, and even ecosystems. High UV levels can stunt phytoplankton in oceans, bleach corals, and damage plant DNA, undermining the foundation of food chains and ecosystems. So while your risk of sunburn might seem like a personal issue, it's actually a symptom of a much broader environmental imbalance. What can be done? On a planetary level, continued support for ozone protection and emissions reduction is critical. The Montreal Protocol remains one of the most successful environmental agreements in history, but it needs to be upheld and expanded to include newer threats like short-lived climate pollutants that also affect UV dynamics. On a personal level, adaptation matters more than ever. Using broad-spectrum sunscreen, wearing protective clothing, seeking shade, and paying attention to UV index reports year-round, not just in July, are increasingly non-negotiable health habits, even in places that once felt safe from the sun. So yes, UV exposure is getting worse, not because the sun has changed, but because we've altered the atmosphere around it. The danger isn't always visible, but the consequences accumulate with quiet persistence. In this changing climate, sun safety isn't just for lifeguards and surfers anymore. It's for everyone everywhere.